That year, Mrs. Evelyn entered the Cozy Corner restaurant in the town of Oak Haven, Georgia, excited to celebrate her 75th birthday. Instead of warm birthday wishes, she was met with cold stares and humiliation from a young waiter named Kyle. Kyle, completely unaware that he was speaking to the mother of the restaurant's owner, denied her service, claiming the restaurant was full, and pushing her into an awkward situation. What happened next surprised even those who had witnessed many of life's ups and downs. Mrs. Evelyn, an elderly black woman, had been a regular at Cozy Corner for years. This restaurant held a special meaning for her, a place she often frequented with friends, family, or simply alone, to enjoy the cozy atmosphere and delicious food. Today, on her birthday, she hoped to be welcomed warmly as always. As she entered, she still felt the familiar ambience, the lively sounds of conversations, the clatter of dishes, and the enticing aroma of the food being prepared. She looked for an empty table, but her gaze stopped at Kyle, and waiter. He stood at the counter, frowning in annoyance. Mrs. Evelyn didn't pay much attention, thinking he was just tired after a long shift. She approached him and smiled. "Hello, I have a reservation under my name, Evelyn." Kyle glanced at her over his notepad, his eyes showing something strange, making Mrs. Evelyn feel uneasy. He replied curtly, "There are no tables available right now. They're all taken." Mrs. Evelyn frowned, not understanding why her reservation wasn't being honored. "But I called yesterday to confirm. Maybe there's been a mistake." Kyle sighed impatiently and retorted rudely, "I said there are no tables. You should find somewhere else." Mrs. Evelyn's heart tightened. She was a regular, knew all the waiters by name, and had never encountered such treatment, but she sensed there was more to it than just a full restaurant. Kyle's gaze, his rudeness, it was all too familiar. Experiences from her childhood still haunted her. Despite her inner turmoil, Mrs. Evelyn tried to remain calm. She took another step and asked, "Are you sure there's no place for me? Perhaps I could wait by the counter." Kyle crossed his arms, smirking, "I've said all I need to say. There are no tables, and that's not up for discussion." Mrs. Evelyn felt the eyes of everyone in the restaurant on her. She didn't like attracting attention, especially in moments like this, but this time was different. She wasn't just a customer, she was the mother of the owner. Although she didn't want to use that status as a weapon, she felt she had to stand up for her rights. She suppressed her anger and disappointment, tried to calm down, and asked, "Perhaps you don't know who I am." Kyle looked her up and down with disdain. "I don't care who you are. There's no place for people like you here." Those words struck her like lightning. She was shocked. Prejudice still existed, even in her community, and even worse, in her son's restaurant. But a familiar feeling rose within her, the need to fight back. Mrs. Evelyn was no longer a young girl who could be easily intimidated. She had endured years of struggle, learning how to protect her dignity, but at this moment, she felt conflicted. She was tired. Age and years of fighting for justice and respect had taken their toll. But she realized that backing down now meant accepting this injustice, and she had never been one to give up. Sensing her hesitation, Kyle grew bolder, his smirk widening. "You think you're allowed in here just because you're a regular. You don't belong in places like this anymore." He quickly glanced at her old bag and worn shoes. "Go back to where you came from." Despite her fatigue, Mrs. Evelyn stood up straighter. Determination was bubbling inside her. She remembered her son, James, whom she had always supported, protected from injustice when he was young, when he was searched randomly by the police. They had fought together against a system that had no place for people like them. Now, she couldn't stay silent. At that moment, murmurs began among the diners. People started to raise their heads, paying attention to the conflict. Some took out their phones to record what was happening, and posts began to appear on social media with comments about the blatant discrimination. The digital age was on her side. People could no longer silently witness such things without being implicated. Mrs. Evelyn looked at the other patrons. She knew that if she left, she would be left with a feeling of defeat and helplessness. She couldn't do that, not now. Taking a deep breath, She raised her hand to signal someone from the management. "I want to speak to the manager." Her voice was still calm, but it held a firmness. Carl hadn't expected things to turn out this way. His arrogance quickly gave way to confusion. He looked again at her modest appearance, seemingly thinking her words were just empty threats. However, he reluctantly went to the counter to call his superior. While Carl was away, Mrs. Evelyn stood her ground, trying to gather her thoughts. People continued to look at her, whispering, but now their eyes held more curiosity than judgment. Social media was buzzing, posts, photos, and videos spreading rapidly with hashtags condemning acts of racism. Unbeknownst to her, Mrs. Evelyn's fight had become a public event. She felt a small sense of satisfaction rising within her. Perhaps this was what was needed to show that people like her would not back down in the face of injustice, even when they were tired. A few minutes later, the restaurant manager, Mr. Michael, emerged from the kitchen, nervously adjusting his tie. He had received many messages about the unfolding event and the attention it was attracting. He was clearly very worried. As soon as he saw Mrs. Evelyn, his expression changed. He recognized her immediately. This was James's mother, the owner's mother. He stepped forward, trying to defuse the situation, but it was already too late. The situation was escalating, and more customers were witnessing the conflict. "Mrs. Evelyn," he began as he approached her, "I apologize for this misunderstanding. Let me help you find a table." Mrs. Evelyn looked at him, her gaze calm but firm. She could have let Mr. Michael resolve everything now, but she understood that the problem would not be solved simply by seating her. This wasn't just about a bad waiter, but about the deeply ingrained systemic bias that had infiltrated even the places where she thought she would always be welcome. People could no longer just turn a blind eye to such incidents. "You don't need to apologize to me," Mrs. Evelyn said firmly, her eyes sweeping the room. "You need to apologize to everyone who has faced similar discrimination. This isn't just an incident, it's part of a problem that needs to be addressed." Mr. Michael hesitated, feeling even more eyes on him. He knew that if he didn't act now, the consequences could be far more serious than a few dissatisfied customers. He saw people filming the scene, knowing that the story would soon be online, and he didn't want this restaurant to be known for a scandal involving racial discrimination. Meanwhile, James, who had seen a video of the incident, was rushing to the restaurant. He felt anger and disappointment that this was happening in his restaurant, a place he had worked hard to make a symbol of hospitality and respect for all. As soon as he entered, his face was cold and resolute. He saw his mother standing tall in front of Mr. Michael and Kyle, who were trying to justify themselves. James approached them, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere. "What's going on here?" Kyle turned pale, realizing who was standing before him. James didn't wait for an explanation, his gaze fixed on Mr. Michael. "Why is my mother standing here, having to endure this humiliation? I opened this restaurant so that everyone would feel welcome, regardless of who they are, and instead, she faces discrimination." Mr. Michael tried to explain, but James didn't give him time to make excuses. He turned to Kyle. "You're fired. Leave the restaurant immediately." Kyle didn't argue, his face contorted as he realized he had lost his job because of his prejudice, and he quickly left. Meanwhile, people in the restaurant continued to record the event, and within minutes, the video of Kyle being fired and James's firm words began to go viral on social media. This moment became a turning point not only for the restaurant but also for how society received such incidents. James turned to the diners and staff. "My mother should never have had to go through this. No one should have to go through this. I want everyone to know that there will be no place for discrimination here, and this applies to all of us. We will do everything we can to ensure that something like this never happens again." The entire room applauded, and the room was filled with cheers of approval. The community's support gave strength to both James and Evelyn. At that moment, it was clear that their struggle had not been in vain. Social media had become a powerful tool in the hands of the people, and this incident would not be ignored. Although exhausted from everything that had happened, Mrs. Evelyn was proud of her son. This day had become not just her birthday, but a symbol of how wrong actions can have a big impact when they stem from a fight for justice. After Call was fired, the atmosphere in the restaurant gradually calmed down. James, standing next to his mother, addressed everyone present, "Thank you all for your support. This restaurant is a place for everyone, regardless of race or background. We will do everything we can to ensure that such incidents never happen again." His words were met with applause, and the support from customers became a reminder to both James and Evelyn that the fight for equality never ends. Social media was still buzzing with comments, and the videos from the scene had spread across the internet, bringing the story to a wide audience. Mrs. Evelyn looked at her son with pride. This day was not only her birthday but a symbol of the power of community and their shared struggle against injustice. James promised to implement staff training programs and support initiatives aimed at promoting equality and tolerance. When the restaurant was finally empty, Mrs. Evelyn and James sat together, realizing that this day had marked an important milestone not only for their family but for all those who faced prejudice. Their struggle had become an inspiration to many, and James continued to work to ensure that fairness and respect would always reign in his restaurant.